Welcome to this video on the Priestess. We moved on now from the Magus in the previous video on the Major Arcana series and come across this lovely, beautiful figure in the background, and she sits behind a thin veil of light. So there's a lot of symbolism associated with this card, as we can see from the diagram that I will use and its labels here that we'll talk about. But first we'll have a look at the divinatory meanings of this card. The actual symbolism is very similar to the High Priestess of the Rider-Waite deck, although the cards look very different. Here she sits in front of a veil of pomegranates. But we'll talk a little about this card as we go through this video. First of all, we'll look at some common divinatory meanings, and then we'll go on to the deeper aspects of the card and how it fits in with the spiritual journey. Okay, we'll look at some divinatory meanings for the Priestess. If the Priestess is upright, she can represent a platonic friendship based on spirituality. These are just examples. A period of solace to get in touch with what you really want and to let your mind then process these things. Because the Magus was all more about the conscious mind. The Priestess is more about intuition, so that would indicate a blending of the two. Changes on the inside are needed in order to bring about changes on the outside of your life, because she's all about the inner meaning of things. The need to connect and be more confident with your intuition or feminine side, that's regardless of gender. And she could indicate an active spiritual path, being inspired and intuitive, also going with the flow of life, which is very important, as we'll see as we go through the video. So those are some very simple, basic divinatory meanings that she could represent. Essentially, they all connect with the same thing, which is your intuition, and developing that as a tool, letting her be your sort of spiritual guide in a way. If we look at the Priestess in a reverse position, then we get different definitions or different meanings. It could mean that we're just looking at the surface of things without any depth or understanding, ignoring our spiritual side and our intuition, being too dominant in our mind, an unwillingness to accept our more gentle feminine side, not making enough time for spiritual study, denying your spiritual guide. I think I've mentioned this one here. Also struggling spiritually, trying to get behind the veil but not succeeding. So that would indicate that someone's spiritual path is hard going at present. So these are some basic meanings for the Priestess in the upright and reverse position, and you'll see how these statements here bear out when we look at the symbolism and other philosophical aspects of this card. The Priestess occupies a very elevated and privileged position on the Tree of Life. She occupies the path between Tiphareth, or Christ consciousness, and Keter, or the Father. So we have the Father and the Son, representing the journey of the soul to God. And she occupies this middle pillar, which crosses this black line, which I've drawn in to represent the abyss. She also goes through a dimly visible Sephiroth called Thoth, which essentially again is like a hidden knowledge. So she's all about the soul's return to the Father, and this is what she does in this path called the Uniting Intelligence, because she unites the triad here, Keter, Chokmah and Binah, with the hexad. They're not including Malkut in this description because, as in previous videos, I've said that sometimes that is just seen as being the fallen one from the Tree of Life. So essentially she separates higher consciousness from lower consciousness, and she is that veil of light. And by attuning to her, the veil is lowered so that we see what is behind the veil. We see the spiritual consciousness and move away from the material. And that's essentially the process that she is representing. This principle is also seen in the Rider-Waite card, where you have the pomegranates in the background here. So we have the supernal triangle here, her triple moon headdress here, again representing Thoth, or the full moon, and you've got the 13th path of uniting intelligence going right through her to this cross, as I mentioned about Tiphereth and being Christ consciousness. So these principles still play out even in the Rider-Waite deck, even though they're not so obvious. At the bottom of the card here we see that the astrological attribution of this card is the moon, which represents the highest form of the divine feminine in the priestess. We'll also see in the next section that the moon has a less elevated position in the actual moon card, which is further down the Tree of Life. But here it's the most elevated position it can have, and it's represented on the headdress that the priestess wears, as we saw in the previous section. The Hebrew association is Gemel, which means camel, as we see here in the foreground of the card. So going back to our earlier diagram here, or earlier image of the priestess, we've got the camel here. The camel has a very significant part in explaining what the High Priestess is all about, and we need to go back to our trusty old Tree of Life to understand what that process is. A camel is essentially an animal that carries an internal water across a desert, and if we think about being lost in the desert because it has no reference points, we get very similar to the concept of the abyss here, which separates, or is that veil between the supernal triangle and the rest of the Tree of Life. And the priestess occupying this path here crosses this veil. Now the camel holds water, and for those of you that are familiar with the Greek terminology for the states of consciousness, I've gone through it in my website in quite a bit of detail. Water represents a state of consciousness like the baptism of the Bible, but it's not a physical water, it's actually an internal state of consciousness, which is what it is representing. So with the camel holding the water here, the only way to cross this abyss into the spiritual realms is to actually contact that internal water, that internal nourishment, which illuminates and reveals the spiritual worlds which are hidden behind the veil here. In this next section we'll look at the symbolism contained within the priestess card. So first of all we'll have a look and see what is happening in the foreground here, in front of the veil. In front of the veil we see a collection of fruits, flowers and crystals, and these are representing the beauty of the creation in a sense. but they're also the illusory bit, because they still represent the parts of creation with an identity and separateness. Crowley, though, calls these the seeds of creation, or the beginnings of form. So we have the illusion of the separateness of creation in front of the veil, and the hidden truth of creation behind it. In this foreground, we have a flower with 10 spiral petals representing the masculine, and we have a flower with 10 concave petals representing the feminine. So there's 5 in the foreground, 5 in the background. So we have a masculine and we have a feminine, and we have the camel, which we've talked about in the previous section. And if we look on the Tree of Life, we have a masculine pillar here. We have the feminine pillar here, and the camel in the middle, which is exactly what we've got here. We have geometric crystals on this side here. We've got a pyramid, and these are very similar to Plato's forms, and these are the forms which are said to make up the entire universe. So when Crowley talks about the seeds of creation, that's really what he means. The grapes are associated with Dionysus, and the pine cone with Bacchus, and we've talked about these when we came across the Fool card in terms of the intoxication. So here the intoxication would mean intoxicated with the beauty of the outer creation, and not necessarily the spiritual energies within. So this is essentially saying that these are a distraction to our spiritual journey. So we'll now move up the card and have a look at the veil itself and the priestess and these 2 pillars either side, which are not as obvious as in the Rider-Waite card. The first thing really to notice as a difference with the Rider-Waite card is the fact that the priestess sits behind the veil, whereas if we take a look at the Rider-Waite card here, she sits in front of the veil of pomegranates, and indeed in the background we have water here. So again, we talked about water as being a state of spiritual consciousness, as identified in Greek terminology, which is used biblically. And it represents, as I said, states of consciousness. So this is the veil of illusion between form and formlessness, between the world of Maya and the world of spirit. Although in reality there's no distinction between them. There is no veil, it's just an illusory veil. So note there are no organic forms behind the veil, they're all in front of it, because there is no separation in spirit. The priestess therefore represents that she's like the conduit for truth, which lies behind all the illusion of separateness which makes our creation unique. She's like the holy guardian angel, in a sense, taking us to our highest state, which would be in Keta, at the top of the Tree of Life. The main veil that you see here represents the abyss. And we looked at the abyss in the section on the Tree of Life. The 2 pillars here represent the pillars on the Tree of Life. The right one representing the pillar of mercy, and the left the pillar of severity. So here we have the pillar of mercy, the masculine, and the feminine, the pillar of severity. In the Rider-Waite card, they have the initials B and J, which represent or stand for Boaz and Jachin. And these are supposed to represent the two copper, brass or bronze pillars which stood on the porch of Solomon's temple, which was the first temple in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is, I don't think I've ever been through this. Yeah, it is on my website in the Mystic Bible section. If you take the word Jerusalem, it actually means higher state of consciousness. Now we go to the top part of the card, and we have the waxing, waning and full moon here at the top, which is essentially the crown of Isis that we see here. It doesn't mean to say that the High Priestess is Isis at all. And we have, and I've numbered 7 crescent moons emanating from her crown. The number 7 is associated with Venus. So why is the number 7 associated with Venus? Well, all of the planets have magic squares. The numbers of Venus that are associated with Venus are 749, 175 and 1225. And it gives you the information here that each row and column of the magic square contains 7 numbers. The square contains 49 numbers in total, and so on. Magic squares of the different planets is a whole topic in itself, so I won't go further into that. We also have this astral vision. I call it the astral vision because it's got different colours in it. And she has a lemniscate, which is the infinity sign around her eyes, which is the fact that she is along the path to the infinite, which is Keter, and beyond to the 3 veils. The astral is essentially a plane of consciousness which is well below the white light of Keter, and in fact herself, she is pretty much represented in white. And so you see the initial vision of the astral here, but behind that and well beyond it is the white light of pure spirit. And notice that the bow and arrow are white as well, along with her throne. So she has like this astral vision, and when you first see light inside, it may be of different colours and different shapes of the astral level. This headdress of the waxing full moon and waning moon is all about change, and there is the title Change is Stability, because we get stability in the sense that she's consolidated on this throne here. So how can change be stability? Well, it's 2 things. For a start, when you're sitting in meditation, if you expect things to happen, then they frequently don't happen, because you're just stuck in rigid thought forms of where you think you should be and what spiritual planes look like. There is a need to let go and go with the flow. And in a more worldly sense, say if you are in a relationship and you say, oh well, I've been hurt loads of times, you are essentially being stable to the point of your reference, and you're not going with the flow. And this card is all about going with the flow. So this concept where you've got change in terms of the moon and stability in terms of the throne is something that people need to meditate on. So we said that the 7 was associated with Venus, and the whole purpose of that is that it is connected with the Empress here, ruled by Venus, who is Isis, with the moon headdress here. And the Empress crosses the path and is intimately connected with the path of the Priestess. Also on the Priestess, if we look at the arrow here and this astral light, it also connects with the art card. And as you probably know from now on, from my previous videos, I'm very big on connecting the cards together. So here we have on the art card, which is all about the integration of opposites within the self and is further along the path than the priestess. We have the arrow here, and we have the astral around her shoulders and through her breastplate. I did say that I would come back to the moon, and here we are. We have here an inverted crescent moon, which is in alignment with the crown of Isis at the top. I said that she had a favourable position with regards to her relationship with the energies of the moon, and that is because of her elevated position on the tree of life, which is in the middle pillar here between Tiphereth and Keter, but the moon itself as a card is between Malkut and Netzach, so it's much lower down and on the side on the pillar of mercy here on the right hand pillar, but it's much further down, linking this emotional Sephiroth here with Malkut, which is the earthly realm, which is why the moon card itself is much darker, because you get much more embroiled in the lower vibrations that the moon puts out. So the priestess is much more in tune with the enlightening intuition that comes from the reflective nature of the moon. The last bit of symbolism to cover is this bow and arrow here, and there is some ambiguity as to just exactly what it is, and you can see a little bit more of it in the background. We have Lady Frida Harris calling it a sistrum here, which is a musical instrument of Isis, and we see her with the triple moon headdress, whereas Crowley relates it to Artemis, and we've talked about her. And it's also been related to Apollo's lyre here. Now, really, the principle behind both of these is the same, and that is, if we take the glyph of Sagittarius here, he's using this bow to fire the arrow or his will to the upper planes of consciousness, and he's directing his concentration upwards away from his animal nature here. The lyre ultimately represents the musical sounds of the inner planes of consciousness. So whether we're looking at the will of Sagittarius or the lyre, which is representing the musical tones of the eternal Om, you're looking at the same thing. Now we're looking at the transition between the Magus and the Priestess. In this transition, we have gone from structuring our lives and creating things that are useful for our spiritual quest in the Magus to actually being in touch with our higher intuition and our spiritual guide internally, which essentially leads us towards our union with spirit. So the Magus does the external organising, and the Priestess connects us internally with our spiritual energy for higher work. And since she connects Tiphereth with Keter, she represents the energy which guides our soul or higher self, which is Tiphereth, to its final union with spirit, which is Keter. So that's the son going back to the father. The fact that the Priestess appears so early in the card sequence of the major arcana doesn't mean that we have not a lot of work to do, because we still have a lot of the cards still remaining for the fool to transgress on his spiritual journey. So now we will look at some applications of the Priestess to the Celtic cross. So in this last section, we look at the application of the Priestess to the Celtic cross. So if she appears in the very first position here, she represents the dominant energy of the spread, what it all centers around. So that's really the heart of the situation, and you have to connect with your spiritual source and make it a central part of your life, just like she's a central part of the spread. Position number 2, if the priestess is in the crossing position, one possible meaning for this could be too much engagement in the material things, what is happening in the foreground of the card, and that's a reflection of what's happening at the surface of your life. It implies the need to look deeper with what is resonating inside and connecting with your intuition. Position number 3 here, how subconscious influences. It could mean that our intuition is waiting for us to connect and use it as a life tool for the better. So in this position it implies it's lying dormant at the moment. Position number 4, recent past influencing situation. If upright, it can mean alignment with your spiritual guide, which has brought you to the present moment, and you need further guidance as to how to progress and move on. An example of it being reversed could indicate that you've not gone with the flow of the situation and maybe have been reluctant, if it's a relationship, to move on from past bad experiences and past hurts, and therefore we have this situation here where the other cards are giving guidance as to how to move forward. So quite different meanings for the upright and reverse position there. Position number 5, hopes and goals here. That's aligning with your soul's purpose and finding a deeper meaning to your life. And this relates to card 10 also. Position number 6, near future. Take a step back from what you're doing, create some space and use your intuition as a tool for answers, rather than the mind which is over-analytical. Card number 7, how we are affecting the situation or our self-image. Perhaps we're holding things back, as does the priestess. We don't reveal our real self unless someone is showing genuine interest in what we hold to be important. So in a relationship setting, that is someone who doesn't let other people in that easily. Position number 8, how others are affecting your situation or your external environment. This could well be a prompt to use a meditation or other spiritual group to further your soul path, support your inner journey, and find others around you that are of like mind. So it may mean that, in a positive sense, to move forward for spiritual support in your environment, to complement the work that you're doing when you're on your own. The priestess in position number 9, guidance and warning. That could be all about learning to trust your inner voice, your intuition as to what feels right, and not to always override it with the mind and the intellect, but essentially try and blend the two so you've got two useful tools. To align with your soul purpose as much as possible. I've said here, otherwise karma can wreak havoc and steer you off course for long periods, such as getting involved in repeated negative relationship situations, for example. And position number 10, long-term outcome, could mean that you're becoming a spiritual teacher or a guide for others. Okay, so that's some very quick definitions of where the priestess applies to a Celtic crossbred. So hopefully this video has been of help, and I will see you for the next one, which should be the Empress.